I want to begin just by offering a genuine thank you to Ian and to all the faculty and staff and others who've made my visit possible. It's truly been a pleasure to get to know everyone here. There's a tradition in giving an academic paper where one says, comments are welcome. I want to repeat that and do so in a very genuine fashion. I'm pleased this particular paper has come back from Organization Science with a second offer to revise and resubmit, and that means I am in the process of revising it, and I will be very, very pleased to hear your feedback, particularly what did you find interesting and what do you find potentially troublesome. So please do not hesitate to interrupt or save questions for the end, whatever your custom is, but I'm genuinely interested in that. Let me begin with a somewhat unusual photograph. I'm not sure if you can capture this on the video there. But this is last week's edition of The Economist, and you can see this image of the thinker sitting on the toilet and saying, will we ever invent anything this useful again? And the subtext here says, the growing debate about dwindling innovation. And if you read this particular edition of The Economist, you can see that there is indeed growing debate about innovation and growing concern that perhaps innovation is dwindling. And this is an important issue, not just for The Economist, but for the world, because if we dig into innovation, and as social scientists this is what we do, we realize that one of the fundamentals of innovation is that it involves recombining knowledge from different sources. Innovation in a fundamental way relies upon knowledge moving across barriers between people, between organizations who then apply it to new problems and generate new things on the basis of this. And social scientists have spent a great deal of time thinking about these issues and making the case that the diffusion of scientific knowledge, in particular, lies at the heart of economic growth. We can move labor around, we can move capital around, but if we really want to understand economic growth, the diffusion of scientific knowledge is absolutely critical to appreciate. I've offered just a few of the canonical sites here, the work of Dick Nelson, Adam Jaffe, Lee Fleming, others who make this argument, but we could fill out many, many slides, including much of the work that's taking place here at SFU, making this case for the importance of the diffusion of scientific knowledge. A fundamental question, therefore, is how does scientific knowledge actually pass between organizations? And here again, social scientists, they have not lost this charge. They have dedicated many, many papers. Again, this is just a small sampling to addressing this question of how scientific knowledge passes between organizations. At the same time, I think this literature is challenged. And I think a fundamental challenge of this literature is that few of these studies, if you actually dig into them, examine how knowledge actually flows. The vast, vast majority of this literature is focused on macro-level phenomena, and I would place those phenomena into two buckets. The first is a focus on alliances. The role of strategic alliances, the length of alliances, who one chooses as an alliance partner, what an alliance portfolio looks like. Important work, but macro-level work, not focused on the micro-level knowledge transfusion or knowledge transmission process. The second, and it's a related set of work, focuses on network structure. So this is the work of Gautama Huya, Wenpin Tsai, Woody Powell, many, many others, but looking at what is the structural configuration of these organizations. How do we understand the organizations as nodes, lines that connect them, and make conclusions about knowledge transfer processes based upon the structure of these actual networks? Again, lots and lots of important work, but primarily sitting at a macro level. And I think as a result of this, there are certain characteristics that are troublesome about the knowledge diffusion literature. One is that this literature tends to view knowledge diffusion as consisting of these concrete unidimensional chunks that are moved from one organization to another. And in this particular way, the knowledge diffusion literature is related to the broader diffusion literature. If you think of the work of Rogers, who has, I don't know how many editions of diffusion of innovations and the thousands of studies that he reports in that important work, many of them are looking at concrete artifacts. How do we understand the diffusion of televisions, the diffusions of a new treatment, the diffusion of an automobile? And generally, we don't look at partial automobiles or partial televisions. You adopt this thing or you don't adopt this thing, and we build our models accordingly. The challenge is that scientific knowledge doesn't follow that particular cohesive chunk imagery, and therefore it introduces special challenges. A second feature of this literature is that it assumes that knowledge, therefore, is straightforward to measure. In the same way we can see if someone has adopted a television because we look into their living room and they have a television or they don't. If they adopted an automobile, we look in their garage and we survey them and we see if they have an automobile. Have they adopted a new technique? As social scientists, we look at patents, right? I think that's problematic. I won't elaborate on it today, but I will provide you with just a little bit of evidence because it's too fun to let this slide. If we look at some of the important surveys that have been conducted of industrial-based R&D managers, and we say, what are the ways in which you access knowledge external to your organization? These are the typical results. This particular one comes from the work of Wes Cohen and his colleagues, and we can see publications and reports, informal interactions, meetings and conferences, incidentally, the very things that we are doing right now, I might say with a smile, are the most important ways that knowledge gets shared. If we look at cooperative R&D projects, we would stick alliances in this bucket. Patents, they're sitting as amongst the least important or least common mechanisms for actually sharing knowledge. I did some work around recombinant DNA in particular, looking at different ways that we might assess the diffusion of recombinant DNA from a quantitative lens, particularly looking at patents versus publications versus licenses. And one of the things I found with this particular work is that patents give us the least purchase on understanding the diffusion of recombinant DNA technology. Whether our interest is in organizations, whether it's just in firms, or even if we limit that interest to firms with products. In this particular work, if we just look at patent citations to recombinant DNA, we're going to miss 80 to 90% of the firms that actually built upon and released products based upon recombinant DNA technology. So the use of these particular measures is another challenge with this literature. And the third challenge I'm going to point to is that we end up with these very stylized depictions of what it is that a university is and how university researchers act, and what it is that a firm is and how firm-based researchers act. And most notably, we think of universities as these open, collective, happy, community-based sharing environments, right? Yes, absolutely. And firms as closed, capitalistic, selfish environments that certainly don't engage in sharing. And theoretically, the basis for much of this argument is based upon important work. Robert Merton, who described the institution of public science and described a very functional sociological system in which researchers are motivated by this idea of priority. They want to be the first to come up with a finding because when you're first, this increases your scientific reputation amongst the community. How do you prove that you were first? You openly disclose everything to the community so that they know that you were first. An important work, Paul David and Partha Dasgupta say, but this is the environment of public science. We have another environment which we'll call private science. And this is the environment in which people are motivated by economic considerations. Because of these economic considerations, they keep things very, very private to themselves. The sleight of hand that many academics pull is to say, public science describes the university environment, private science describes the firm environment. And many, many studies, again, this is your sampling, but we could add many more to this list, have reached this conclusion, or at least based their studies upon this idea that universities subscribe to public science or openness, that firms subscribe to private science or being closed. The challenge here, of course, is if you actually take the time to examine what scientists in each of these environments do. I'm going to show you two pictures. On the left, actually, does anyone know this? I know we have quite a nice biotechnology representation in the room. Does anyone recognize the person on the left? Excellent. I love these pop quizzes. So on the left, this is Kary Mullis. Kary Mullis invented PCR, polymerase chain reaction, when he was working at CETUS. He won the Nobel Prize in chemistry on the basis of this research. And you see him here speaking. And Kary is he's a surfer based in San Diego and very publicly loquacious. He loves to talk about what he did. In fact, to the extent that people at CETUS were very worried about him talking what he did and worried that other companies might pick up on this particular research. Not quite the image of the closed capitalist firm-based researcher that we might be led to imagine from the literature. How about on the right-hand side? Yes, Watson and Crick. Has anyone read James Watson's account of the discovery of the double helix structure of DNA? Secrecy, deception, complete lack of community norms, sexism. Not quite the open university environment that we might be led to believe. So let me restate the problem. we have relied on cross-sectional and organizational level studies that employ data which is knowingly inadequate to provide our insights into a process which is inherently longitudinal, interpersonal, and multidimensional. This is a problem. Put slightly differently, we might ask, where are the micro-level process studies of scientific knowledge diffusion? And my hint for you is that they aren't actually in the management literature. There are people who do this work. They tend to be based in science, technology, and society programs, the history of science, anthropologists who go into scientific settings. They conduct very detailed studies, and yet they have not connected in, unfortunately, with the management literature to think of the broader managerial and policy implications by and large. So the context in which I'm going to address this question, I'm sorry I don't have my clicker, so I'll be constantly leaning over the laptop here, is scientific knowledge. And there are certain specific features of scientific knowledge that I need to acknowledge. The first is that there are multiple mechanisms through which knowledge can transfer. And we'll get to those. That's part of the point of the paper. But I want to acknowledge that there is some previous work here which tries to disentangle the multiple ways in which scientific knowledge flows. The second is that scientific knowledge is what our economist friends might call non-rivalrous. This means that just because I'm using it, that doesn't mean someone else can't use it at the same time. This also introduces supply-side considerations. Usually when we're doing diffusion studies, we're trying to understand when someone makes that decision to purchase an automobile, when someone makes that decision to purchase a new television or not. So these are the demand-side considerations. With knowledge, we have supply-side considerations. When does someone decide to actually share this, particularly because it has this non-rivalrous quality to it? And the third feature here is that we have tacit and explicit aspects of knowledge. One of the things I should have said this earlier, because this is now a work in revision, I'm going to highlight certain parts of the data and certain features of the data that aren't expanded upon in the paper, and maybe leave others on the table. So I would enjoy your feedback. And one of them I'm going to try to expand on in the talk that isn't as apparent in the paper is this idea of the tacit versus explicit dimensions of scientific knowledge. And within these criteria, I'm going to focus specifically on the diffusion of scientific know-how. I'm distinguishing this from know what, that is simply knowing that something is, but not knowing how to do it, and know why, that is having a theory as to why something works as it does. I'm less interested in the why and more interested in the how. Ian?
Is know-how totally tacit? Or can it be explicit as well?
My perspective is that it's both, and I'm going to show some data to try to persuade you of that perspective, but I'm curious if that will agree with you. Okay, so the specific research question I'm asking, what are the mechanisms through which different aspects of scientific know-how diffuse over time, and how do disclosure tensions shape these processes? The way that I approach this is via inductive case study research around the diffusion of know-how for very specific scientific techniques. As I was constructing the sample, I had several criteria in mind. The first thing is that I wanted technologies that had both university origins and firm origins to tie into this literature, that perhaps there are important differences between universities and firms. Technologies that are both patented and published. If any of you know the work of Fiona Murray at MIT, who studies these patent publication pairs, we can take this as indicative that there's both basic research interest around this particular knowledge and also commercial potential around this knowledge. And also similar technologies. In this particular case, these are discontinuous technologies. They're incredibly important technologies. In the biotechnology case, they both garnered Nobel Prizes. In all four cases, they led to multi-billion-dollar industries. So these are very important technologies. At the same time, I will be the first to say that we might ask some generalizability questions as to whether this applies to more mundane, perhaps, or less impactful technologies. And finally, I wanted pairs from different fields. This is an attempt, while acknowledging that I have a limited number of cases, only 4, to still get some generalizability out of this. And the way that I did this is by looking at some very, very different fields. Biotechnology, I know that many of you in the room are familiar with this. Formal alliances, science-driven, PhD-level participants, for the most part, very long product development cycles in the range of 10 years, very, very capital-intensive. And across all of these dimensions, the world of digital audio looks very, very different. few formal alliances, an engineering focus, contributions coming from people at all levels of education, very short product development cycles, not very capitally intensive. So a nice field contrast here. If you saw the paper, you saw the particular techniques that I'm investigating. So in the biotechnology world, the university origin technology is recombinant DNA. I think most of you are familiar with how this technique works. It's also called gene splicing, but the idea is to take a piece of DNA to combine it with recombine it with another piece of DNA. This is a recombinant idea, therefore creating something new. PCR has origins in a firm, particularly the firm Cetus, later acquired by Roche. And the technique lets us exponentially multiply genetic material. So the idea is that we start with our double helix, we strip it apart, we can then match up each side of the double helix, which doubles our amount of genetic material. We repeat this process over and over, thereby exponentially multiplying the genetic material. In the digital audio world, I really should have had the sound examples for that next time. Waveguide physical modeling is a sound synthesis technique. It relies on the idea that we can use equations to describe the physical wave motion of a sound in a real instrument, such as a guitar, which I've depicted here. As you pluck the guitar, a wave travels along the string, then it moves back and forth, and we can write out an equation that describes this particular wave motion. What this allows us to do in the physical modeling sense is to create very, very realistic reproductions of sounds that have almost no memory requirement. So it completely wipes out the requirement of memory on your devices. It uses only computational power. Perceptual audio coding comes from AT&T Bell Labs. Most of us know this for the MP3 standard. So it opens up the world of the iPod, sharing files legally, of course, over the internet with your friends, and other such applications of compressed audio. I'm basing this study on interview data. Kathy Eisenhart suggests that when you do interview-based studies, you employ, and this is her quote, numerous and highly knowledgeable informants who view the focal phenomena from diverse perspectives. And Kathy was on my committee, so I took her advice to heart. I had no choice, yes. And you can see here, this is my interview sample. I conducted a number of these interviews myself, and these are with all participants at all sorts of different levels. Not just famous endowed chair type scientists, but also graduate students who are just learning how to use a technique. Not only practicing scientists, though they formed the bulk of my sample, but also people in complementary positions like technology licensing, attorneys for firms who might have an interest in what was shared and what was not shared. But the biggest thing that probably jumps out at you, because you're an astute crowd and you're looking at this and you're saying this, Andrew, it looks to us like the vast majority of these interviews do not have the personal label. You're drawing on external sources to inform your study, and that's absolutely right, and it is somewhat unusual. So let me offer a few words of explanation as to this use of external interviews. I have 4 justifications for this. One is it allows me to dramatically increase the range of subjects that I include in this particular study. So I interviewed about 40 people myself, but I have twice that many interviews that I can draw upon from these external sources. To say a word about these external sources, these are conducted by historians of science as oral histories. So the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley is a nice example. Sally Smith Hughes, who has a background in biochemistry, conducted these interviews, puts them up online due to a grant that the Bancroft Library has, and they are widely and openly available to any researcher. But importantly for us as social scientists, she carefully documented her protocol and the way in which she conducted these interviews so that we have some sense of the methodology underlying them. My second justification here has to do with the influence of questions on interviewees' responses. One of the questions that we always ask about an interview-based study is, Andrew, did the way in which you asked questions reflect your priors about what you thought you were going to find, such that people answered them in a way that's going to support the hypothesis that you had going into this study? That's always a fair enough question. One of the nice aspects of these external interviews is because I had absolutely no role in constructing the questions, it allows me to compare and contrast the data from external interviews versus the data from my own interviews to assess if there's any bias. And perhaps not surprisingly, of course there's not. So, excellent. Yes, you're convinced. Good. The third is naming of names. In order to elicit what I thought would be more truthful responses, I went into each of the interviews that I conducted with a guarantee of anonymity. In some ways, what we're discussing here could be considered violations of the norms of science. John, is it really the case that you didn't share this particular idea with your colleague? It's your colleague. How could you not share this? John, knowing that John's name wouldn't be reported, I thought would be more open to sharing it. At the same time, my master's is in economic history. I have an inherent interest in the history and the development of these fields. I think many of you in this room do too. It's fun to name names. It's fun to know, is this coming from Stan Cohen? Is this coming from Boyer? Is this coming from other canonical players in the history of these industries? By using these external interviews, I'm able to name the names and give a little bit of the sense of that historical development. Yeah.
To that point, Andrew, I think, first of all, I think it's brilliant that you increase your data points by using these different sources, and I think it's a great idea that I'd love to copy. The other point that I wanted to make is to exactly the justification that you're saying about using these, that I'm sure you're dealing with in the review process, about naming names. The reason that you made for keeping your interviews confidential and anonymous it makes me question whether the other interviews, the flip side of that, are the other interviews going to be really, are they going to be frank and are they going to be honest? Or is it going to be a constructed story? Now, in the case of the double helix, yeah, it probably is, pretty frank and honest. But I don't know about those other interviews, and maybe you could talk to that about about those case studies that you were not case studies. What did you call them? You called them
oral histories.
The oral histories, yeah,
right.
About how authentic you think those are.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. I think that is a concern with them to some extent. I think the response of some of these, if you go back. If you look at the interview dates here, these are the dates that the interviews were actually conducted, and you see, going all the way back to 1982 in the case of the RDNA interviews. The date that the interviews were released, however, varies widely, in some cases 10 or 15 years after conducting the interview. The explanation given in the oral histories for that is, well, we wanted to go back and check these interview transcripts with the interviewee for accuracy to make sure that the names were correct. But I also wonder if it doesn't play into the very question that you raise. If I were to say next week that there are certain things I didn't share with you in this presentation because I thought maybe they gave me some sort of advantage, that could be a bitter point. 10 years from now, if I say, do you remember 10 years ago when I gave that talk? Well, there was something. So I think one point, A, your point is very valid, and I'd love to investigate that further. B, I think that in some ways it's eased, or our concern can be eased by the fact that there is this delay between conducting the interview, the events described, which often happened even earlier than the interview, and then the actual release. But it's an excellent point.
Just on a follow-up on that,
Yeah.
You might want to, explicitly craft what the timing is between when the oral histories were done and when the actual events took place. Because if there is that cushion of 10 or 15 years, at least between them, then I agree that it makes the authenticity much more highly credible.
Yeah, it's a excellent idea. I think the challenge, and this is maybe a preview of the talk itself, is how do we exist in this world where we're pulled between tensions? On one hand, it's great if there's a long delay because it eases these concerns. On the other hand, it's not great if there's a long delay because one of the justifications I'd like to offer for using external interviews is that it mitigates retrospective bias. The technologies I'm investigating, because I wanted to capture this very long time series of what happens after invention, are stemming from the 1970s and 1980s. The challenge is if I go in as a researcher in 2010 through 2013 and interview people about events that took place in the 1970s, of course we would be justifiably suspicious of how people might reconstruct these narratives and their motivations and incentives and so on based through today's lens. And so one of the nice things of these interviews, drawing on something from 1982, is it's much closer to the events at hand. On the other hand, your excellent comment raises the question of, well, the closer it is to the events at hand, the more we might be concerned about some of these other factors taking place. And that's a good point. I need to think about that more. Other questions on the interviews? Okay. I supplemented this with archival data from a number of sources. These are detailed in the paper, so I'll simply skip over them for now. Ultimately, my idea here was to go through these interviews and through the archival data where they supported this and to pick out these descriptions of achieving know-how. How is it that someone learned how to perform one of these techniques? So let me take physical modeling, the sound synthesis technique, as an example. I was less interested in how did you learn that Julia Smith came up with waveguide physical modeling? I was more interested in, okay, you're now doing waveguide physical modeling. You're building upon this technology. How did you learn how to actually do it? And what I found across all of these interviews were 278 descriptions of what I've labeled here, achieving know-how. And the first thing I did is to code these for the particular sharing mechanism used. You'll see examples of those in a moment, but let me give you an example just to be very clear. And I'm actually going to read this off of my phone. I somehow left my own copy of the paper elsewhere. But this is someone who says, from a basic technical level, I knew what was involved in implementing waveguides. There are a number of parameters, however, that I couldn't get from that high-level understanding. Working side by side with Julia Smith, literally sitting down at the same terminal and talking through the code, I came to understand how the implementation worked and how I could morph it over to my application. So this is hey, backup copy, excellent. This is terrific. So this is an example of a way that someone achieved know-how, is this sitting down side by side. I coded for the associated time period. I coded for the tacit and explicit dimensions of what took place. So for example, let me elaborate momentarily on what I mean by tacit. I mean understanding that has not been articulated. And there's a whole literature here going back to the work of Polanyi on what constitutes tacit knowledge. I'm taking a very simplistic definition here of it's tacit if it hasn't been written down, articulated, codified in some particular way. I don't want to get into the argument of is it possible to make this articulated or not, and we can have some discussion around that, but let me give you a very specific example to show you how I'm thinking of this. And this comes back to our same interviewee who says, it's straightforward to set up a bidirectional digital delay line. That's been well described in the literature forever. So for me, that particular aspect is explicit, but then you have to match the excitation to the other physical parameters, and if you don't get it right, the model simply won't play. So that particular aspect of performing the physical modeling technique was not well described in the literature, and therefore I'm coding it as tacit. And you'll see further examples of how I'm treating that. And then finally, I coded for these disclosure tensions themselves. An example of this from the rDNA case, we have Herb Heinecker, who was a researcher at Genentech at the time, and said, we presented the data showing the DNA sequence without showing the DNA sequence, but we did give this picture of what the molecule looked like. So sharing some things, but not sharing other things in the context of a meeting here. And then the final thing I did is to look at the relationship between these different elements.
Could you explain a bit more what a disclosure tension is generally?
Yes, yeah. So this is good. So this is important. What I mean by disclosure tension is this idea that on one hand, there are benefits to disclosing. We might think of this as a community-oriented benefit to disclosing, going back to the public science idea. When I share something, then people know that I know this, and then they think more highly of me, and so on. There are also privately motivated reasons that they might disclose something. I know that if I share something with Ian, then he might reciprocate and share something with me. I'm not doing so because I have this community-oriented idea. I'm doing it because I have this exchange relationship in mind. So motivations to disclose. Then there's this idea that if I share with Ian, he's going to scoop me and come out with the article before I do, so I don't want to share. If I share with Ian, he's going to know what my firm is working on, and so I don't want to share with him, and therefore I'm going to keep things secret. And what I mean by disclosure tension is the tension that a researcher faces because on one hand, this idea that they want to share with others, on the other hand, this idea that perhaps that will harm them.
Is it fair to compare different technologies? There may be intrinsic qualities of the technologies themselves that lend themselves to different tensions and different techniques.
Interesting. Say more.
Not only is the culture of internet firms different in the sense of being very pro-disclosure,
right,
but they may think that even if I try to make this knowledge proprietary, sooner or later someone's going to figure it out, whereas with biotech, they may think they can hold on to the intellectual property longer, and so there are more effective property rights.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. I need to think more on that. It's part of what I was trying to get at with this narrowing emphasis just on know-how, just on these radical discontinuous techniques that have a great amount of tacit knowledge attached to them, at least very, very early on. And in that way, it is different than simply sharing the example you give, I think, is a nice one. A bit of code for an internet startup or something, which is very readily perhaps understood and transportable to different environments. I think one of the places to push in this paper is, therefore, these conclusions that I'm reaching apply to the kinds of technologies that you're describing. And simply on the basis that, given the 4 cases I've identified, which all have these special features, I can speculate, but I can't speak to that. It's a good point. Okay, we haven't got to the findings yet. This is the important stuff. This is the fun stuff. So let's. As a quick roadmap, here's what I want to show you. This will differ just slightly from the paper that you saw. The first is to quickly review the various mechanisms and their use over time. The second is to speak explicitly to these tacit explicit dimensions. That's a little play on words there. The third is to give some examples of secrecy and openness. Fourth is to talk about what I see as really the fundamental integrative role of personal connections. And then the fifth is to try out a new model on you. The reviewers have pushed some. In the words of one reviewer, which I absolutely adore, he or she said, I love your model, or at least I love the idea of your model, but I'm not sure about the specific model. And I think, that's great. So I will enjoy seeing if version 2.0 or more realistically 14.0 works with you. So sharing mechanisms. As you saw, I identify 4 primary mechanisms: hands-on training, conferences, seminars, meetings, publications, and finally tools. We've already heard some examples of these. For example, the firm-based physical modeling researcher who says, I learned this from Julia Smith working side by side. Herb Boyer, who co-invented the recombinant DNA techniques, says, hands-on instruction was probably the fastest way to go early on, probably for the first year or so. This was the way to learn how to do recombinant DNA. Presentations, such as you're attending right now, were a second important mechanism. Arthur Riggs, who was at City of Hope at the time, said, I learned recombinant DNA from Boyer in 1973. He came here and gave a seminar very early on. That was probably a few months before I went out there for that summer. So in this particular case, it was a presentation that was the sharing mechanism. Karl-Heinz Brandenburg, who was with AT&T, co-invented the PAC techniques. And we, of course, went to conferences. In fact, the World Space Project was very important. That was the first consumer electronics application for this technique. They had somebody visiting the MPEG meetings. MPEG is the group which, okay, you know it. So again, presentations, very important. Publications certainly play a role as well. Daniel Oppenheim, who was at MIT, in terms of disseminating what's going on, we keep things low profile, then we use a conference, then we publish in the appropriate places. And he's giving a sense of the temporal ordering of these mechanisms, which is important. A university-based biochemist, PCR got published, and eventually it got described very, very well in the literature. And the final mechanism here is tools themselves. If we look at the practice of any of these techniques today, it's primarily through tools which embody this knowledge, and I'll elaborate on that momentarily. Mary Betlich, who was Boyer's lab technician, said, now recombinant DNA is just a lot more streamlined. You can buy commercial kits to do this. One of the university-based physical modeling engineers said we developed an editor for putting together digital signal processing components. We also created models that ran with that editor. The idea was to make the technology more accessible. So we're going to create a tool which gives people the know-how or the ability to perform these particular techniques. And what I did is to then look at these 278 descriptions and to associate them with different time periods. I used increasing windows because I think we're more interested in how do you gain access within the first few months versus few years versus what's the distinction between 8 years and 10 years and 12 years, and we might throw those all into simply a latecomers bucket. And if we do this, you can see I've highlighted in red the dominant diffusion mechanism at these different points in time, and what we see is they shift. And so early on, the way that you access this is via hands-on direct training, then seminars and presentations play a more important role, then publications, and then finally, the point that we're at with each of these techniques today, tools are the dominant diffusion mechanism. Earlier, I suggested that tacitness simply is whether something has been codified or... Oh, sorry, question.
Were you surprised that it didn't differ between the 4 types of innovations, or the two industries, more specifically? It looks pretty similar between the two different industries. Similar. And did that surprise you?
It did. One of the reasons, as I alluded, that I chose different industries with such different characteristics is to look for some kind of differences across them. One of the things that popped out of this study is that the general processes were the same. The general tensions that these researchers described and faced were the same. My twist on that is perhaps then this is a more generalizable phenomenon, at least for these techniques with these particular kinds of characteristics. But yeah, yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
One of the things that stands out for me there is hands-on would be informal, very informal, and publications and tools are formal, much. Right. So I'm wondering if in the early stages it's really leaky diffusion of know-how, i.e. like people really talking when they shouldn't be and gossiping, and whether that's actually going on in terms of, and as the knowledge gets more advanced and you're less worried about people scooping you and beating you to the goal, then you're happy to switch to it. And I'm wondering if you have any comments about that.
I do. I'm going to save it for later, because I think what we ultimately end up with is a model in which all of these things are intertwined. So to preview that, yes, it's leaky via hands-on training early on, but that leakiness is kept in check by the fact that the way that you acquire hands-on training is by having a deep personal relationship with someone who knows how. And where you have a deep personal relationship, that person is therefore less likely to leak. And so we end up with this system in which the various components reinforce one another. Yes?
It may sound a little tangential, but one thing that's rarely emphasized is the cost of failure in all these studies. And the benefit of failure is you know what doesn't work. And I wonder here whether, particularly in that early period, what you're seeing is a close group of people who they want to bring up to speed so that they don't have to repeat the failure curve.
Elaborate slightly.
Because if you're doing a hands-on thing, then you can communicate not just what has worked, but you can tell people next to you what hasn't worked. So you're actually passing on a lot more information than just this code works. You're actually saying, and by the way, we've done 10 other things. In publications, all you're passing on is what does work.
Right. It's an excellent point. Yes, I think you're right. Yeah.
Just failure is rarely talked about.
Oh yes, and that's a broader problem, I think, in the management and innovation literature generally, in the entrepreneurship literature, where I play a great deal. We tend to select unsuccessful cases. And it's a problem with this sample. More generally, these are all techniques that worked. If you look early in the history of PCR, for example, all of Kerry Mullis' colleagues at CETUS, with just one or two exceptions, thought he was crazy and that this was a failed technique. And even after he had results that he thought were successful, they thought they were failures. So the failure certainly is an undercurrent here. You're right, though. I mean, your specific point of one of the things they're doing is sharing what doesn't work through some of these mechanisms and not doing it through others. That's an excellent point, and I need to think about that more. Yeah.
In regards to PCR, I know that there's a Russian group that claims to have invented a process before Kerry Mullis.
Yeah.
I was wondering if did this data set draw mostly from one nationality? Was there any looking at worldwide and international exchange, especially across language barriers?
Across language barriers, no. And that's an excellent point. It sounds like I should talk to you more about the Russian group in particular. It does move across geographic barriers into Europe, specifically in Western Europe. Herb Heinecker, for example, who was one of the very, very early practitioners. This isn't a recombinant DNA, so I'm speaking of the data set more generally. But Heinecker takes this back to the Netherlands, trains his former supervisor in the Netherlands, who then takes this around to various parts. And one of the things which is not part of this study, but as I've traced the participants and their connections along with their geographies to form a network map of sorts of how does this knowledge actually move into different areas. But the language barrier is an inherent limitation here, particularly even on the quantitative study. I showed you some early results from RDNA as I was motivating this talk. Those are all English language publications and patents that I'm basing that upon. And so I'd love to talk with you further about maybe some ways to capture non-English informants into this. Okay, on the tacit dimensions, I suggested earlier that I was going to treat tacit simply as whether or not something was codified and not whether it was possible. And this is because I want to suggest through this work that tacitness is a constructed characteristic. And this comes out of the data. One of the informants, this is a physical modeling researcher, and I'm sorry, I will again read from my phone because I know exactly where it is on the phone. But the physical modeling researcher described this process and says, I could have tried to write up all of the parameters, the temperature in the room, the surface on which my speakers were sitting, the kind of processor in my PC. And then I wouldn't have actually been doing the research. I'd simply be describing it for others. So in practice, you tend to find a balance. This is suggestive to me because someone reading his publication might want to know all of those other features because it would play into the way that they would describe the technique. They would describe that particular knowledge as tacit. To this particular researcher, however, it's simply that he wasn't motivated to describe all of these things that might enable someone else to do this. And this has me thinking about the ways in which tacitness might be constructed or be a learning or might interact with these learning processes associated with these different mechanisms. So if we look at interactive performance, for example, here, we have this person who says, it wasn't until I sat down with Mary and we stepped through each of the parameters together and listened to the effects that I finally got it. So the reason that hands-on training is so important is because it's actually enabling this transmission, if you will, this learning of the tacit parameters that aren't described in a publication. And this is particularly evident in hands-on training, but it's also evident in these other processes. In presentations, for example, Kerry Mullis described how he gave a presentation describing PCR. It was a lengthy presentation, just like this one, where you would think lots of things were shared. And yet Tom Caskey came up to Mullis after this presentation and said, great, so how do you actually do it? And it was that process then of the question and answer, what I've called here detached questioning, that really enabled them to learn the tacit knowledge. Again, these were things that Mullis could share, but he didn't share, and it was through that detached question-answer process that people like Tom Caskey then learned the technique. And of course, we see this in publications too. An RDNA researcher who learned this technique later did not have personal connections to the earlier practitioners, but said you start to read between the lines of different publications. Because by definition, all you see in the publication is what they choose to put there, but you can start to put different publications together. And the phrase he used and others used too is you read between the lines and you start to see how they're actually doing this. So the idea here is that tacit knowledge isn't simply something that can't be described. And in this way, it just differs from the Polanyi's sense of how do you ride a bicycle? Well, I can't describe how you ride a bicycle, you just have to do it. Instead, through these mechanisms, in different ways, you learn how to describe the tacit aspects. But this raises the fundamental question then of, well, what do people choose to actually share? And one of the things I find is, in contrast to this very stylized image of the open public science university, the closed private science firm, is that both university and firm-based researchers face tensions towards openness and secrecy for both commercial or private and community or public reasons. So we might contrast this if the usual image in the literature is universities subscribe to public science and therefore engage in open sharing, firms subscribe to private science and therefore engage in secrecy. What I find instead in these data are that universities subscribe to both public and private science at different times, leading to both open sharing and secrecy associated with each of these reasons, and firm-based researchers approach the same dilemma. And therefore, the question of what do they share becomes more a question of what do they share when, through which mechanism, and via which aspects of tacit knowledge. So let me elaborate slightly on this. Time is an incredibly important consideration in this process. In 2007, decades after RDNA was invented, the person said, of course, it's kind of a nonsensical question now. Everyone knows how to perform recombinant DNA. Why wouldn't I share with someone? In 1973, the year in which it's invented, however, this is a very important consideration. It varies according to diffusion mechanisms. One of the perceptual audio coding co-inventors said, there's a difference between sharing this technique with your friend at the lunch table and standing on a chair and announcing it to the whole cafeteria. And I asked him what he meant by this, and he said, well, sharing with someone hands-on or in a question-answer exchange after a meeting, that's like sharing with somebody at the lunch table. Throwing this thing in a publication where anybody can read it, and I don't even know who's reading it, that's akin to standing on a lunch table, and you want to be very cautious about doing that. And the third thing that these researchers engaged in is this very conscious manipulation of tacit knowledge. One of the PAC researchers said, there's an advantage early on that no one really knows how much we know. This means that people cannot share things, and others don't know if they're not sharing them because they don't know them, or they're not sharing them because they're subscribing to these private science or other motivations to keep things secret to themselves. And many, many interviewees elaborated on this process by which they would pretend that they didn't know things and rely on the ambiguity around tacitness to reinforce this. So the final point I want to make here is that personal connections are what hold this model together. Personal connections influence the decision to share, they influence a researcher's access to these different mechanisms, and they influence the extent to which someone shares, the explicitness. So as an example of the decision to share, one of the digital audio researchers said, it's hard to connect and share with people with no context. If I know someone, or if I know someone that they know, then of course I'll share, but it's hard to connect and share with no context. And what I did is to go through and code each of these mechanisms and look at, were they accompanied by a description of a personal connection? And what we see is that in every single case of hands-on training, there is a personal connection underlying the use of this mechanism. I was actually surprised that these latter percentages were as high as they were. That even in the case of publications, people often described seeing a preprint version of a publication or being alerted to an important publication via a personal connection. But personal connections are absolutely central, and you can think of overlaying this particular chart with the one that shows time. Such that early on, we're accessing this via a hands-on connection. The way that we access the hands-on connection is through the personal connection. So that the personal connection itself assumes significant importance early on and fading importance as we move through time. The personal connection also leads to more explicitness. This is one of the lab techs who said, I feel special knowing how to do some of these techniques. If a brand new postdoc wants to learn, I'm not going to give up all of my secrets right away. There's these power games that take place in these labs. A personal connection would afford greater explicitness. So in the paper, I offer the following model of how these things play together, where we have these tensions between pressures to withhold for academic or commercial reasons and pressures to share for academic or commercial reasons, and that these play out over time through our different sharing processes, as mediated by personal ties, and then these tactics of delaying sharing or partial sharing. I want to try out a different model, and then I would especially appreciate your feedback on this. And that model is as follows, that we might start with the idea that a knowledgeable person who can perform one of these techniques faces a decision on whether or not to share this know-how. And there are negative pressures based around competitive concerns, whether these are with reputation or with protecting commercial interests. And then there are positive inducements to share, whether this is due to following norms of science or due to this desire to participate in a knowledge network and an exchange relationship, such as I described with Ian earlier. And then typically what we'd see based on the current literature is that this decision, influenced by these two things, is what leads to the recipient's know-how. What I'd like to suggest based on this study is that we're missing a few steps in that process. So one of them is to look at what is the actual mechanism which is being used to share. And that interacts with how explicit are we being about this? What is the level of detail that we're sharing? And what is the actual learning process which is being used? And these things interact with one another, and they are shaped in crucial ways by this personal connection. So personal connection mitigates these competitive concerns, it has a positive influence on the decision to share, and it influences which mechanism we can use, the level of detail, and the particular learning process. So we end up with an image which is more complicated, certainly, but also more reflective of the actual process and the considerations that go into a researcher choosing to share know-how. There are several implications that I'd like to draw out of this work. Yes?
It's a great study, and it's incredibly fascinating. And the only question I have is, you started with a critique of diffusion studies as focusing on televisions, etc., as kind of objects that are relatively stable and diffuse in that manner. But it seems like you're treating these in a relatively similar way, that there's know-how that doesn't change over this whole process to do these transformations or either mathematically or genetically.
Yeah.
And that the process of talking with people, sharing it, publication, and down to tools doesn't seem to affect what that thing is the whole way. And that the process of giving a seminar, for instance, or doing hands-on work with someone is simply a one-way sharing process rather than a kind of negotiation of what a tool is or how it's used or what it might become.
Right, right.
And I wondered if you thought about, for instance, why you're here giving a talk. And on one hand, you're sharing with us. On the other hand, you're taking notes, you're getting asked questions, you're negotiating what the meaning of your model is.
Right.
And I know this is different than doing recombinant DNA or whatever. Not less important, but different. And so I wondered if you included the idea that hands-on, particularly, and then seminars and even publications, was more of a kind of social negotiation of what this object is, what it can do, how it's done, process, how that would affect your description of the process and how it was done, why it was done.
Good. Excellent. That certainly happens. It's been a challenge to reflect given the complexity of this already. But what it suggests to me, I think that might be the most interesting part. What you've hit on might be the most interesting part of this process. And that is the way in which the knowledge itself is transformed. In many ways, my thinking about this for the social scientist in the room is shaped by the Wanda Orlikowski's way of thinking of the way in which these things are constructed. And that knowledge, again, as I critique the prior literature, isn't somehow disembodied or disconnected from the social context in which it's interpreted and used and so on. The place to push then, if I understand it correctly, is the way in which these particular mechanisms and processes shape the knowledge itself. And that's something I certainly saw particularly with the early mechanisms. One of the reasons, and this doesn't come out at all in the paper or the talk, unfortunately, and I need to bring this out more, one of the reasons that people would share via hands-on training is that the inventors themselves described this as a way to understand what it is that they were doing. I don't understand why PCR works in this particular way. I know that there are certain temperature constraints. I know that there are certain substances that need to be involved, but how, by working with other people, they were then able to change their own understanding, such that these techniques themselves then changed. The way that PCR was performed by Kary Mullis for the very first time in 1985 or 1986, depending on whose account you believe, is different than the way that PCR is performed today. And that's an important point. I need to bring that out more.
In terms of the time component, as Tom was mentioning, the analogy with yourself, how do you track the time component in terms of the knowledge? So for instance, you're sharing, if I make some assumptions, you're sharing this because this is a fairly advanced piece of work. It's at a revise and resubmit stage, so you're less worried about people quickly doing several years of work and replicating and catching up with you because you already have a first mover advantage. You're sharing it as a sense-making activity because you're still needing to make sense of it in terms of doing things. And so this particular example, the timing, so you wouldn't be doing this presentation 5 years ago because it would be an embryonic idea that you want to keep and not disclose and everything else. How is that sort of captured in terms of the the examples that you have in terms of the stage of the advancement of the technologies.
Right, yeah, and I think that nicely ties into Tom's point that again, I will use myself as an example. If I were to give this presentation 5 years ago, as I was first beginning this study, it would look very, very different. Even if none of these barriers or considerations applied, if I simply said, forget it, everything's on the table, copy the database off my computer, here are all of the interview transcripts, it would still look very, very, very different. And my only response is I need to better account for that in this particular model. What I was looking for and what I was coding for was the actual ability to perform the techniques and the different aspects that played into that ability. But what I'm getting very good pushback from both of you on is that isn't capturing the transformation in the know-how itself, which takes place over time, and that needs to be better accounted for.
I think the knowledge transformation affects the know-how mechanisms.
Right, right, yeah, exactly. So, right.
So following from those 2 points, and I'll preface this by saying I don't expect this to come into this paper, but I did wonder about the recipients and what understanding you have of the recipients in your data or in other data that would talk about their capacity to absorb. So what is their background? Do they have similar fundamental training that they draw upon? And then their ability to transform. So you and I had an earlier conversation where we were talking about interdisciplinarity. And so do they have a set of skills from a past experience that allows them to take this and combine it and push it in another direction?
Yeah, yeah. And they do to different degrees. It's not something I have systematic data around. Not even as a matter of coding. I'm not sure if I have the data, period, depending on which dimensions we're interested in. This is a matching process, certainly. My background is, my first degree was in digital audio and digital music. So as I myself perform some of these techniques, given that background, that's much easier for me to do. As I was engaged in this study, I relied on a friend who was a biochemist very early on and said, I want to learn about PCR, show me this. And this is actually quite simple to do. Those of you who do PCR, you simply buy a machine. You can do PCR at home now. It's a $600 machine, and Wired wrote this up last year. And so that actually is quite straightforward to do, but if I were to try to do it 15 years ago, because of my prior knowledge, as the recipient, my characteristics as a recipient, to your point, that would be a very different process than someone who already had a PhD in biochemistry trying to do that exact same technique. So yeah, that certainly plays in here. I'm not sure how to best account for it in this particular model, where my primary interest was in what guides this decision to share or not to share, and less on what guides the way in which someone learns. Mm-hmm. But that would be the interesting counterpoint to this.
Hi, I'm just coming at this from my my studies in economics in my undergrad and like the work I do as a fraud examiner in incentive analysis and things like that. So I'm just wondering, have you looked at this from like a game theory or a prisoner's dilemma perspective? Like just as a rather a simplistic example, like there's the provider and the recipient, and the provider of let's say there's grant funding at stake. So the provider and the recipient, if they collaborate and share knowledge, they can maybe get a bigger grant. Mm-hmm. And if they don't, then one might get all of it or some of it. Like it's kind of looking at it from like an incentive analysis perspective and in game theory.
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't looked at it from that perspective. As you describe it, my prior would be that might be more applicable to some of these mechanisms than others. So if we think, for example, of sharing through a publication or sharing through the creation of an automated tool, that's a very different game and a much more complicated matrix. If we think of simply a sharing, a one-on-one kind of sharing, and am I worried that you might then take this, then game theory might be an interesting lens to consider this. Thank you for that suggestion.
I have a quick one. Where is the role of feedback in your model. So by sharing knowledge that you actually personally gain some knowledge from your audience. Where is that in the model?
So that's I was going to interpret feedback differently. That is the feedback into some of these reputational reputation building, for example, or into expanding the network. But your last clarification of feedback into your own knowledge.
Yeah,
this is the, and picking up on Tom's and Ian's point, this is where I need to really bring this into the study. Going back to this idea that one of the reasons, particularly early on, that the inventors themselves share is because they get something from that exchange. This isn't simply them sharing what they know, it's them learning through the process of trying to share. And many of us who teach as a living experience this, that by trying to explain it to others, it actually changes or increases our understanding of the very thing that we're trying to teach. Thank you, yeah.
Just on the basis of your results, you've got a box that says decision to share. It would seem to me, just on your results, that the next box is not which mechanisms and the level of explication. The next box is who and what are the trade-offs, the decision to share is based on which personal connections are going to trade this information for their benefit.
Right.
Your decision to share becomes a calculation of the decision to share of the next person, as it were.
Right.
And then you get into presentation publication tools. Anyway, that was just picking up also on those previous questions about the prisoner's dilemma and the recipient's abilities. But it's also, is this next person's likelihood of sharing, have they got a bigger incentive to share? So if they get this information, are they in a better position to advantage it than I am?
Right, so there are a few different pieces there.
Yep.
One is I take your suggestion of move this personal connection, which in some ways is capturing features of the relationship down here rather than being a moderator as it's pictured here. It's sitting right in the middle of the model. The way that I have treated this personal connection, and maybe this isn't right, but the way that I've treated it based on the way that interviewers describe it is the stronger the personal connection, the more that I can rely on it to protect my private interests. So Ian and I go back 10 years. We're very close. If I share this with him, he's not going to share it with someone else. Ian and I just met. I vaguely know him. He seems kind of a dodgy character. Because that's a less strong personal connection, I might be reticent to share. But what you're pushing on is really that there may be more dimensions to that, and an important dimension is who else does Ian know? Even if he's a dodgy character whom I don't know well, that's okay because he doesn't know that many people anyway. But thank you for allowing this example. But if instead he's a central network node, if we think of it in that imagery, then it might shape my decision. And that's good feedback. It plays a little bit into Stephanie's point about what are the characteristics of the person with whom you're sharing, and how do they feed back into this model.
Hi, Andrew. I'm thinking about the data, the rich data that you have, and I'm wondering if you might consider another model, or if you have already, if it's been on your drawing board already, a temporal model, right? And I'm thinking about Utterbach and Abernathy's model of dynamics of innovation over time, process innovation, product innovation, dynamic, dominant design. And I'm thinking the data that you have and that you showed us, that showed over time as you move from mechanism to mechanism, if you had just a very simple time axis and then you looked at when mechanisms were more likely, and then as you showed it cut across the industries, and then you could show pressures that are changing. Those pressures are changing over those times too. Right? And so what pressures might lead someone, or as the time from innovation has passed, you have different constraints, because as you said, it's no big deal today if you show someone how to use recombinant DNA, right? So maybe that's, right.
So this is, but this is good. This is one of the things I've struggled with. But in some sense, I'm hearing you say, don't abandon this quite so quickly, where there is this inherent notion of how time plays into it and how the pressures themselves, you can see, I should maybe make these arrows different widths or lengths or something, but over time, we don't really have pressures to withhold.
Yeah, I
This
wouldn't abandon the temporal axis. I had forgotten this was the kind of model that you put together, and maybe it's actually a simpler model. You know, maybe it's not. Yeah. Anyway, I'll think about it a bit more. But
I'd love your feedback.
I think the time aspect is critical to what you actually have unearthed with your data. So.
Right. Thank you.
I'll make it very short, sorry. Just thinking about Kuhn's model of, a paradigmatic change.
Yeah.
Is it possible, have you observed groupthink here, where it actually makes some sense to go to non-personal ties because the person that is on the margins is more likely to innovate?
There is some of that. I'll give Kary Mullis again, the PCR inventor, as an example. The two people with whom Kary Mullis shared this idea first were his lab assistant, who only had a high school education, and I think was dating Kary's daughter or something, if I remember. Some very strange connection, and the patent attorney. And notably, he didn't share it with other researchers who were at a similar level to him. And part of his explanation is they were willing to believe me. So this might play in there some. I didn't see how I do see, I guess, how it's connected into these dilemmas about do I share and how much do I share. That's interesting. I'll have to think about that more. Yes.
With regards to the data you showed, what do you use as the start of recombinant DNA technology?
Good. Yes. So I'm taking 73, which is the publication of the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science paper, which is where Cohen and Boyer would peg it also. Now, this is a more complicated history, and based on your question, I suspect that you're aware of it too. Cohen and Boyer did not receive the Nobel Prize for recombinant DNA. Paul Berg did. And there's a question with any of these techniques of where do we actually establish the starting point? Where do we take something like this forward? That's inherent, I think, with any technology, that there is truth to the saying that there's nothing new under the sun. My starting point, however, was informed by the inventors. But.
Just as a follow-up, because it's kind of disparate to how PCR was invented by Kary Mullis in a moment. He just had a brilliant thought, and but recombinant DNA technology, been decades long of people building on these ideas and working with different organisms. So assigning a single start date and then going year 1, year 2, year 3 behind it,
I'm not going to help my case here. I think that's actually an oversimplification, though, of PCR. I mean, Kary Mullis says, I thought of this as I was driving to Mendocino. And for legal reasons, he would love to pin the invention of PCR to that. But if you look at the actual performance of PCR, that doesn't quite work that way. Well, when did he first perform the technique? And then you look at some of these early things, and we have reproductions as he's trying to make sense of the data. And he would look at the data and say, November 1985, clearly it worked. And you can look at Kary Mullis' lab book and see that he says clearly it worked. He went around to other scientists, also experts in the exact same area at CETUS, and said, clearly it works. And they said, no, it doesn't. After another year of experimentation, then Mullis says, so even in the Mullis case where we might say, there was this aha moment as he was driving to Mendocino, and that was the point of invention, it's hard to narrow it down to a start date. I completely agree with you with recombinant DNA, and I don't want to tell this story that somehow Cohen and Boyer were the only people responsible for this. At the same time, I think it's almost undeniable that what Cohen and Boyer did was incredibly novel and moved that science forward in a dramatic fashion. But no, it's a valid point.
I don't know if your presentation will show this later, but does the research show if people are better off monetarily, since this is a business school setting, for doing the private, choose not to share versus the public share, and then they end up giving information away for free, like Google, which is different, but mostly, I guess.
My research doesn't. I think the general research consensus on that very important question is that oftentimes monetarily for the particular individual or organization, it doesn't necessarily pay off, but for the system as a whole, it's absolutely critical. So if we imagine, and this is other work I'm not showing today, but if you imagine instead this whole network, and there are two ways in which this network could function in a very stylized sense. One is that everyone shares everything with everybody else. So every node you can think of as fully connected. The other is a world where nobody shares anything with anybody else. And between those two worlds, the more that the network as a whole leans towards more people sharing, the healthier the network is, the more innovation that comes out of it. And yet any particular firm might be advantaged by, in a sense, it's a game theory kind of question, by deviating from that norm and keeping things. But that's far, far from what I address here, and I won't pretend that my data can speak to that question.
I have another idea.
Yeah.
I have another idea of how you might be able to represent this. What about taking that graph or the table that you had that I loved, that showed the 4 different cases and showed the percentage that you'd coded painstakingly of what mechanism was being used at what time away from the time of the invention. What about just doing those exactly in the same style as you look at product and process innovation on the Abernathy and Bitterback kind of chart, right? And just so you're just having a peak. Right, so then you would see the peak first that happened with for each mechanism. So you just have mechanisms, percentage use on the vertical axis and time on the horizontal axis. You'd have those 4 peaks. And if you think of in that model, they don't talk about all the pressures in the model. They just show those, that representation of what happens, and you talk about it elsewhere. But it might be just a very nice, simple, because you'd see the different mechanisms take over from each other.
That's interesting. I should have another look at how they depicted that.
Yeah. Because it might be. I mean, I really like this, but it might be that there's too much.
Yeah, and generally, I'll use that as a segue. I think one of the challenges I have with this paper is that there is too much. Let me show you that by quickly stepping through these discussion points and the things I hope to raise, because this also ties into the model and what should the model actually address itself. The first thing I hope to do is to highlight how these different mechanisms are used over time. So for the most part, the literature doesn't consider different mechanisms at all. To the extent that it does, I'm thinking here of the work of Wes Cohen, the Jay Agrawal, Rebecca Henderson survey pieces, but the mechanisms are essentially treated as substitutes. It's like, I can share this thing via publication, or I can share it via patent. It doesn't really matter. What I'm hoping to do here is to show that these different mechanisms are not substitutes. They actually serve different roles, and that there's a distinction between when do we share something and to what extent do we share something. And we see this in the mechanisms of when is the mechanism active and to what extent is it active. Hands-on sharing, for example, I think we all have appreciated, wow, that's incredibly important to the diffusion of these techniques. If we look at the actual numbers of sharing and how did people learn today in 2013 how to perform PCR, it's not through hands-on sharing. It's through going out and buying one of these tools, which essentially embodies the knowledge, what Cologne would call incorporated knowledge. So tools maybe aren't important in a temporal sense, or they don't play that early temporally important role, and yet in terms of magnitude of contribution, they're incredibly important. So trying to point to these different roles of the mechanisms. The second thing I'm trying to do is to make this case that tacitness itself is this consciously manipulated feature of knowledge, not an inherent feature of knowledge, and I've tried to provide some evidence around that. That means that particular mechanisms aren't more or less tacit. And tacitness doesn't necessarily decrease over time. To go back to the example of the PCR machine, in some ways knowledge is very tacit. Many people who conduct PCR by using a machine could not actually do PCR in the way that Kary Mullis did PCR early on. They don't have that tacit knowledge, if you will, of how to perform the technique. The third thing is to highlight that sharing itself is not a binary decision, but rather a multifaceted consideration. And here I'm aiming particularly at surveys, as valuable as I think they are for their own purposes, but things conducted by Blumenthal, Campbell, their many, many colleagues. And this is, it's important work. It was published in Science. But the questions that they ask are, do you share or do you not share? And I think one of the things that we see from this work is that that's not the right question to ask. The real question to ask is, how do you share, through which mechanisms, with whom, and when? And unless we really unpack those different dimensions, we're doing a disservice to our conceptualization of knowledge flows by simply saying, do you share or not? And the final thing I'm hoping to do here is to really push on this integrated view, and this is where the model again comes into play of how do all of these things influence one another. One implication here is that you can't change one element of the system without affecting everything else. You can't simply go out and say, we're going to provide grants for our researchers to go out and give talks, and that's going to increase knowledge diffusion. If they don't have personal connections to those people, if they aren't sharing certain things through those talks, you could provide all of the grants you want in the world to do that, and it's not going to make a difference. And we can see, with many, many policy initiatives, not appreciating the way in which these various factors influence one another and trying to say, we see this in the university licensing world, we'll increase the number of patents coming out of our university, and therefore we will have more commercialization. Without appreciating the ways in which all of these other features of the system influence one another, those policies won't have quite the same effect. So that's the end of my slides. I just wanted to get through those, but I would love more and more of this feedback.
This is a question that I was going to ask before you got to your discussion.
Yes.
And it was, the question was going to be, if you stepped back and became a historian again and not a management whatever,
right.
How would you finish this paper? I mean, what exactly would you say? And then it turns out you said it in the discussion. So I'm wondering about the pushback towards what I perceive as this artificial need to create a model.
Right.
When in fact what you have accomplished from a historical lens or from a lens that historian would take is, I've now pointed out all these things in a temporal dimension of how innovation diffuses.
Right.
Or knowledge diffuses, rather.
Right.
And I don't know why you can't somehow summarize that in a way that connects more explicitly to the literature or creates testable propositions against the existing literature, rather than trying to force a model. Because you saw what happened here. Everybody takes a kick at this, and you'll in the end maybe come up with something, but I think it's going to come up with something for reviewers.
Right. Right.
That's a harsh judgment, but
no, that's legitimate feedback. I think it's something we all struggle with, particularly, and I might characterize it as as a feature. I'll throw this in the bucket of interdisciplinary work. Of work which is drawing upon social science theory, which is inherently historical in nature, which is combining in some senses, as you saw in the early slides, some rich qualitative data, and there's this whole quantitative piece which is not integrated, not because it doesn't contribute to the story, but because strategically it complicates things immensely to try to get through the publication process with both of these hats on. So I take your feedback.
Dangerous feedback.
Yes, Vance.
So assuming there's no more questions, I would like to thank you for coming and for joining us here at the Beatty School of Business. I'd like to thank Andrew. He's put his email up there, so he is inviting discourse and further sharing in terms of connecting. I'm sure that's one of the reasons why he's put it up there. In terms of incentives behind this know-how sharing meeting, we have a little bit of lunch outside waiting for everybody. And so please enjoy, and thank you very much, and thank you for the CMA and the CMA Centre for Innovation.